So the community of faith, one of the things I should just make really clear, because I've written so much about it now from the book and then rewritten this section so many times, I don't remember what I said. So let me just be clear that a community of faith can be very narrow. It could just be your family, in which case, it's a really obvious how entwined your faiths are. And you clearly feel that if your child is hurt, you've been hurt. You clearly feel some responsibility for your sister or your brother, and feel some kind of sense of entwined faith. The more interesting question, and we know that there can be very restricted communities of faith, where people are excluded or the identity is based on some fairly narrow definition, which leads to, I wouldn't call those positive communities of faith, that's all, and leads to all kinds of ethnic, racial, religious, etc. strife. What we were really interested in the book, we wanted to show that it was possible to have an expanded community faith, one in which you could recognize your fate as entwined with others you would never meet, or the probability of meeting them was extremely low, whether it be the poor person in some other part of the country who needs welfare or health care, or whether it be the Indonesian peasant who was about to be attacked by the Dutch Armada, right? So that's the expansive community faith. The interesting problem, and this sort of leads to your second question, the interesting sort of, I don't want to make too much claim here, the interesting question is, what do governments and citizens do to construct and reconstruct, expand and decrease these communities of faith, and with what consequences for the larger physical culture? So the example that I at the end of the paper that I sort of really am enjoying playing with, and I'm not sure it's going to work out in the end, really has to do with, and it was very influenced by the fact that I saw the Great Society all the way, and then the Great Society one Sunday, and the following Sunday saw Selma. So the Great Society was really in my mind here. But one of the things that you think about is the effect of the Civil Rights Revolution in the U.S. was in principle to expand our community of faith as a polity, right? So that we really thought about others who had not necessarily been part of our community of faith as part of our community of faith, and for whom we had a responsibility not just to assist, but also to listen to. I mean, I think there are multiple aspects to the community of faith. One of the effects of it was you then see what happens in reaction to that is a way to redefine communities of faith again so that they narrow. Right, there are a group of people who say we're all one big community of faith, and then there are a lot of people who become the Tea Party or become the Ku Klux Klan or whatever they become, or something else. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be that nasty, but who, say, wait a minute, they really aren't part of us, and by helping them, you're hurting us, and redefine it that way. And that also affects the fiscal culture, right? And creates a conflict over what to spend on that has a dynamic of its own. So that's what we're trying to play with, those kinds of transformations that happen. And the ones that most interest us aren't the exogenous shocks, but the things that we create politically by moving towards one definition and then confronting people who don't like it, don't want to be part of that, or who want to push to expand it. I mean, it could go either direction.
Hi, so my name is Jerome. I'm a grad student here. And so I was wondering, in terms of shifts in beliefs, how much in the physical culture, how much of this is often driven by war? Because if you think about like fiscal expansion, a lot of it was just the necessity of the war. And I've always wondered, it seems like at the beginning of the war, I mean, if you look at patterns, very often like they need to raise taxes like very fast. At the beginning, they try to finance it by just raising debt, and then at some point they need to increase taxes, and then you have like war taxes that are 90-something% for the top income brackets that are crazy,
Right.
and then it goes back down, but not quite at the same level as it was before. And I've always wondered, it seems that they maintain a fiction for some time, at least at the beginning of the war. This is only temporary, and then we'll go back to normal. And then, you know, when the war ends, there's like this whole, like, you know, how do we reshape the world? And it's just like law that's happening. And then, maybe this is like the moment where you can like kind of, you realize you have a new kind of state of the world, and because the reality is so different, it's just, we try, like this fiction is falling apart, and then you can just readjust. Like this is when you realize that, you know, the beliefs have actually changed. And I mean, I know very little about this, but my sense is that both world wars, I mean, led to an expansion of the state capacity because of the war effort, and then this apparatus was later on used to, you know, finance welfare states. I mean, once the state is involved in the economy, so maybe this is like a vantage point for those shifts in beliefs and fiscal policy.
Well, there's no question that war plays that role, no question. And both Edgar and I have written about that, and so have lots of other people. And it will, if this becomes a book, it will certainly appear there. But what we're struggling with is the things that aren't war, right? There are large periods of peace or relative peace. War might get used as an excuse, small wars sometimes. So if you think about 19th century Europe, or you think about medieval France, even before it was totally France, war gets used as a way to collect taxes, but it doesn't necessarily get sustained. It gets sustained later, in later periods, and gets used in a variety of ways. But the really interesting question is, you know, I think some of the more, at least to me now, are some of the more domestic issues. Not that war doesn't play a part, or the geopolitics don't play a part. They obviously do. That's why I said fiscal culture is part of the story, and the domestic sources of fiscal culture are part of the story, but they can't be the whole story.
Sigrid was next, but Stephen had a two-hand.
Yeah, this was just on the war thing. So I was thinking about the war questions as well, less in terms of the direct effect on, you know, tax and spending, which as you said has, you know, had a long history in the literature, but more on sort of the indirect effects on how does it change what you call fiscal culture. So you need to trace through those in a larger project. So I mean, you see lots of ways in which war or military necessity has an effect on longer term who the we are. Right. So in Peasants and to Frenchmen, right at the beginning of that book, they say, is there a problem in Napoleon's you know, army that lots of people who are fighting don't seem to realize that they're French? And so it's seen as a military strategic issue that you need to enlarge the sense of who the we are. Right, and that then is going to have knock-on effects in terms of whether you think your fate is linked to other people. Or you could look at the American politics literature, which sees that people who fought in World War II and were drafted and came into contact with lots of dissimilar people and thought of themselves as we, then have different views about social policy 20, 30 years into the future than people who don't get those kind of draft experiences in war. So, you know, I'm not thinking of it in just the direct sense of how does war have an effect on spending. There's the indirect cultural sense, and if you can get a handle on that, then you can also work out which of these other levers that you're talking about are having an effect on.
Yeah, that does build on what you were. Yeah.
Consuelo.
Can I also have I'm Consuelo. Can I also add a comment to the war thing? And if it's a civil war and there's a counterinsurgency campaign, I think it's really interesting to see how the state decides, you know, where to go, because you need to hold and clear and occupy territory that you wouldn't have otherwise, because you need to win the war, and then maybe even develop those areas so that actually the rebels don't go back to fighting. So I think that plays a really interesting part in your story.
Yeah. Good. Useful. Thank you.
Is that on this point, Sigrid had anything to say? You're going to wait for Sigrid?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I don't have anything on war, so.
Okay, Sigrid.
I want to echo your Millie's point about like, or acknowledgement that this is really a fascinating project, like thinking about taxation and spending as a coherent whole. I mean, really together as part of the same thing. I agree. I don't think there's anyone who has done it systematically, and it's of course super challenging. But I mean, if anyone is up to it, then it would be you, I think.
We'll see.
So I keep grappling with like how you conceptually distinguish community of faith from, or like which for community of faith from other aspects that feed into a fiscal culture, and whether you can have this similar fiscal cultures, say like high, very redistributive, very like high taxation levels progressively, that are also within a taxation system that is highly progressive, whether you can have that for different reasons, the same kind of principles. And because I keep like returning to the Alesinger Glaser research on heterogeneity or versus homogeneity, because it seems to me that it's fairly obvious that you don't need to do a lot of work to construct a community of faith if you have a homogeneous society. The sense of we is much easier. It is basically already present. So the interesting thing is what happens to societies that are heterogeneous. And this is where I think possibly like it might be that like the state tradition plays a really important role. So the state tradition, how the state formation process occurs. Is it from above? So like if you have a strong, like Germany is it now the example that's floating around in my brain right now, like a very heterogeneous society, but strong order, like, and so order liberalism as a set of elite ideas from above, like gets created, creates this welfare state that is very redistributive, and there isn't really a sense of we that produces it. And then you have like this the from below, like say Sweden, where like farmers and workers together bring about this kind of system. And so then it would be interesting to develop a typology potentially of like, you know, like that has like maybe a 2x2 to start with, like state tradition, a strong absolutist or authoritarian state tradition versus weak one, and then heterogeneous society versus homogeneous society. So to have this societal and state dimensions mapped out, and then that would explain, I mean, the U.S. tradition, the U.S. case much better, I think, than simply the Alesinger Glaser. I mean, that they kind of do look at political institutions. So questions whether that already exists, but I don't know. I mean, they don't really compare across cases. They compare U.S. and Europe,
right,
and like lump all of Europe together as one case. So like that's obviously
a little disturbing.
Yes. Yeah. So, but that would be interesting. That like there's no central state, like in a very heterogeneous society, so that like nothing emerges from below and nothing emerges from above. So that it would be one thought. And like regarding the change over time, I'm not sure. I'm convinced that there is a shift, like that there's a really profound change in the U.S. over time. I think there is some oscillation, but I was just thinking about the Great Depression and the public opinion surveys, which start right then on attitudes towards, you know, unemployment protection and all that, and it's actually remarkably anti, even in the midst of the Great Depression. Like, vast majority of Americans doesn't support like benefits for the unemployed.
Right.
And curiously, like when Reagan starts, like in 1980, when all these cuts happened, 1982, 1983. Like that's not supported by a shift in public opinion. Public opinion opposes that. So that's relatively stable. So these policy shifts happen even though there is no underlying change in in solidarity, in the level of solidarity from below. Not sure like how you would pin that down, that change.
You throw a lot of things at me,
Yeah.
so I do think we are moving, or will have to move towards some kind of typology, and we already identified as something that we have to play with much more than we had so far in the couple months that we've been working on this. The heterogeneous versus homogeneous dimension. And there are a variety of ways in which that comes into play as well. So it's not as easy as religious or ethnic or racial. mean, it's also political